Right. Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Katera Noviello-Kapoor, and I have the pleasure of being the Senior Director of Health Promotion, Wellness, and the Spark Your Health Talk series here at the 92nd Street Y. This evening, Spark Your Health is joined by Dr. Sean Liu, who will be leading us in discussion about the latest science behind vaccines and their development, the current state of vaccines, useful tips when exploring the use of vaccines, as well as the future of COVID vaccines specifically. Our format this evening will be a brief presentation by Dr. Liu, followed by a moderated discussion. Q&A will be worked into the event to ensure that audience members have an opportunity to bring up vaccine topics and questions that are relevant to their personal curiosities and situations. So please feel free to be just submitting those questions throughout the duration of the event, and we'll make sure we get to them either in real time or towards the end of the talk. I would also like to thank our Spark Your Health Talk series sponsor, Mount Sinai Health System, for their generous support. I am now pleased to introduce our speaker this evening. Dr. Liu earned his PhD at Princeton University and is an ABIM board-certified physician in internal medicine and infectious diseases. Since March 2020, Dr. Liu helped to establish the convalescent plasma treatment program at the Mount Sinai Hospital, as well as coordinate multiple COVID-19 clinical studies and much more on the horizon, which we'll learn about this evening. So Dr. Liu, thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, 92Y and Katera for setting this up. And it's a real pleasure to talk with people in the community and discuss vaccines, which I know a lot of people talk about, but I think there always needs to be more discussion and more understanding and education about how these things work.
Absolutely. Well, so with that, I'll let you take it away with your slides and then we'll go from there. We'll meet back in 10 or 15 minutes.
Sure. Great. Great. So let me share my slides. Great. So today I'll be talking about vaccine trends today. And my name is Dr. Sean Liu. I'm an assistant professor of infectious diseases at Mount Sinai, and I'm also the medical director of the COVID clinical trials unit at Mount Sinai in the Division of Infectious Diseases. So I like giving this talk because it really allows me to help everyone understand what vaccines are like. And so this is pretty much like a biology class, and we'll talk about how your body works, the central dogma of biology, and how does immunity work. Then we'll touch upon vaccines, specifically then COVID-19 vaccines, and then we'll talk about a Mount Sinai vaccine for COVID-19. So I think I always like to start off with this slide and really just trying to understand your body. So most of us see ourselves as an organism or person. And then as we kind of put a magnifying glass to ourselves, then we can look at our different organs and look into ourselves. We see an organ systems. And then if you look more specifically into the different organ systems, you see a single organ, and each organ has different tissues. And then as you go deeper and magnify these tissues, you find that you're made out of cells. And so cells are kind of the single subunit that forms all the tissues, which forms the organs, which forms the organ systems, which forms us. And it's a very trippy perspective about just trying to understand who we are on a cellular level. And why do I bring this up? Cells, which many of us may have come across in middle school biology, are essentially factories, and there's so many different compartments to these factories. And there's lysosomes, which degrade things. There's a nucleus, which holds the blueprints such as DNA, that allow for this factory to work and kind of puts the foundation or blueprints for the factory. And then there are different types of ribosomes, which help take these blueprints out of the nucleus and then read the blueprints to produce these proteins. These proteins can then be packaged through the Golgi apparatus, and then you have things like the mitochondria, which are pretty much the energy cell of the factory. So cells, each one of these tiny cells has all these little organelles, or what are called organelles, are mini compartments within each factory, and they all have a very important function. Ultimately, one of the main functions of the cell is really to take these blueprints, or DNA or genetic material that we have, and then export them out of the nucleus, bring them to these ribosomes to really make proteins. And so if we look at a very basic summary of what we are made out of, we see that about 62% of us is made out of water, 16% of us is protein, another 16% is fat, and then another 6% are just minerals and sugars and other substances. So a lot of what we are made of is water. So most drinking water is very important. The fat is really here for energy and storing energy, and the protein is really the functional material for us. And and why do I bring this up? This all relates down to what's called the central dogma of biology. You have genetic material that we're made out of called DNA. That DNA is able to leave the nucleus through a process called transcription, called into something called RNA. RNA outside of the nucleus of the cell then gets translated into proteins. And this DNA to RNA to protein idea, and how these things are essentially different different translations of each other, and they kind of intercommunicate with each other to ultimately make the functional part of protein, is what the central dogma of biology is, or the central belief of biology. And why am I talking about all these things right now? This DNA to RNA to protein idea is everywhere, and it's apparent in all types of wildlife, fish and animals and frogs and insects and people, and and also it's a key thing in microbiology too, in terms of pathogens and microbes. And we see bacteria use this idea of DNA to RNA to protein, and we see viruses use this DNA to RNA to protein idea as well. So we understanding the central dogma really connects all of us together on both an organism level, in terms of macroscopic animals like you and me, and all the way down to the microscopic level in terms of viruses. And really grasping this central concept and how this is a universal central concept is really key into understanding how vaccines work and how immunity works. So how does immunity work? Let's jump into this question. I I always talk about this is, imagine this is your body and it's a dance club, and you have these two bodyguards who are your immunity, and you have Mr. T cell who actually in real life was a bodyguard at some point, and then you have a B cell who has all these antibodies and makes all these little Y-shaped things. So how does your immunity work, right? You have and your immunity, as many of us understand it, is kind of a protective measure for our body. So say a virus comes along, um, and wants to enter our body, and we're exposed to a virus, and it makes its way into our body. Since it's the first time this virus appears, the bouncers in front of that are supposed to protect our body don't really recognize it as a problem. And then it goes into your body, and then all of a sudden, oh no, we get sick, right? Then the bouncers kick out the virus, and now you get better. But the second time this virus comes around, now your B cells and your T cells recognize, hey, wait a second, this virus, this is it'll cause some problems, and it recognizes, hey, these things, in this case, it's SARS-CoV-2 with these red spike proteins. We recognize this pathogen, and we're not going to let it in. and we're going to do our best to kind of prevent it from getting in, to prevent us from getting sick. And that's really how immunity works. Immunity is a learned system. You have to be exposed to something bad, or exposed to an antigen, and in this case, the spike protein, for the immunity to learn how to protect yourself. So, how does a vaccine work? A vaccine essentially um, does not give you the real virus. It gives you pieces and bits of the real virus. And in COVID-19 case, it's spike protein, these red little dots, and that wakes your immune system up and trains your immune system to learn and recognize, hey, whenever I see spikes, it's going to be a bad thing, and we better prepare to protect our body. And so these wonderful videos from the J&J or Janssen vaccine. And I like these videos, even though this vaccine is not available anymore. It really does a good job in kind of explaining or displaying how vaccines work, and in this case, the Janssen vaccine. So in this case, the Janssen vaccine was a virus vectored vaccine where the virus delivered this genetic code into our cells, into these long pink things are muscle cells, and it put this genetic material in, and the genetic material from the virus um, was designed to translate or encode the spike protein. And so now we've delivered this genetic material into our muscle cells, and the muscle cells will use that central dogma to create all of this spike protein. And these spike proteins, since they're getting manufactured in these cell factories of our muscle cell factories, they become what are called antigens to kind of train our immune system. And so now we have these big T cells and these antibodies from the B cells. They recognize these spike proteins and are learning that, hey, this is a foreign protein and this should not be here. So when the actual virus comes along, and in this case SARS-CoV-2 comes along and tries to replicate and invade our body, then these B cells and T cells and these antibodies are ready to pounce, very quickly pounce onto replicating virus and prevent this replication from spreading within us and from hurting us. And so, like I said, vaccines are all about trying to teach your immune system to be prepared for the next infection. And so this concept of vaccines really stems from the first vaccine, when this is a very classical depiction of Dr. Edward Jenner in 1796, where he created this first vaccine. Back then, there was this really bad case, an outbreak of smallpox, and smallpox was pretty much the COVID of the 1796. And he was the first person to realize that people, milkmaids who were exposed to cowpox, did not seem to suffer or die or get harmed as much than the regular population of people. So he then realized that if we gave or vaccinated his first child, he vaccinated this little child and then exposed that child to smallpox, and that's the child actually became immunized and did not get sick or die from that. And so that was where the birthplace of the first vaccine was in 1796. And not surprising, even back then, um, there was a lot of hesitancy and worry that, hey, you're inoculating me with a cowpox. And a lot of people drew these pictures and was like, oh no, we can't be inoculated with cowpox. We're going to start growing all these cows everywhere. And so it really kind of emphasizes that parallel that, hey, even there's always going to be some vaccine hesitancy. And this is historic with the advancement of medical science, unfortunately. So I like this. This is one of those few graphs that really changed my life, where saw this when I was much younger, and I realized that this is a graph that shows the life expectancy by age from 1700 to 2013, and then you see that depending on what age you start at, from 1-year-old to 70-year-old, in general, people's life expectancy increases since the 1850s to the 2000s, increases with time because of modern advancements in medicine and such. But however, there was this huge dip here around 1918 where suddenly there was a huge drop in life expectancy. And this is thought to be due to a combination of World War One and influenza. And so this 1918 flu actually created this huge dip in the world's trend of life expectancy. And so this is put here really to emphasize that infectious diseases and viruses can create a huge problem in our well-being historically. But fortunately, people have created so many vaccines, and now we don't worry about a lot of these illnesses. Measles, mumps, rubella, smallpox, polio, and hepatitis B. And so there are vaccines have really helped us on not have to worry or not have to suffer from a lot of these illnesses. And so here comes COVID-19 pandemic, and unfortunately this is a new type of virus, and we definitely took a hit from this. And every time I make one of these presentations, this number always rises, and it's amazing. So there have been reported 774 million cases globally since the pandemic began, and about 7 million deaths globally. And what does that mean? I always ask, what do these numbers mean? And I always update. I don't know why here we go. What do these numbers mean? So if you take I did a Google search, and just to get a rough idea of what does 7 million deaths compare to in terms of like historically terrible events in the world. You have World War One, which had about 38 million deaths. World War Two, which had 65 million deaths. The Korean War had about 33,000. Vietnam War was 1 million. Afghanistan War, 100,000. Iraq War, 750,000. 1918 flu, like we said, 35 million. And the annual flu knocks out about 34,000 people. So 7 million is pretty considerable. And how are we doing now? And viruses are constantly evolving and mutating. And currently, since December of last year, this one strain called JN1 has really started to dominate in terms of the prevalence, in terms of beating out the other variants. And so if we look at the genealogy or the family tree of COVID-19, we start off with this original strain, and then it's been just evolving like crazy, and now we're all the way up to here, which is the JN1 strain. And I put these here, these dates. In August of 2021, the mRNA vaccines were approved, and so we were able to vaccinate against this. And then the following year in September, there was a bivalent vaccine against BA.4/5 and the original strain, which happened in September of 2022. And then October of last year, this new vaccine came out called against XBB.1.5, and now we're seeing this JN.1.13 arriving too. And so the current vaccines that are available in the United States, there's 2 mRNA vaccines by Pfizer, and there's actually I get this a lot. There's a non-mRNA vaccine? Yes, there's a protein-based vaccine made by Novavax, and they all target this XBB variant as a monovalent variant. So it's only this one strain. And I'm going to this. One of the I guess, criticisms of these vaccines has been that uh, there's very little immune response, mucosal immune response in these mRNA vaccines. Specifically, this was measured in saliva. And so when you think about it, when you get a mRNA vaccine or protein vaccine, classically we get a vaccine injected in the arm, but and then we develop what's called systemic immunity, or we develop strong immunity that circulates within our blood and that protects us from dying. But we don't really develop a strong immunity within our mucosa, which is actually the entry point and exit point of a lot of these respiratory viruses. And so a lot of people are working on trying to create better vaccines that kind of do both and help with this, help do the protection, create antibody response within the blood, as well as create an antibody response within the mucosa to protect us from initially getting this initial, reduce the initial exposure load, as well as prevent us from transmission. And this was one of these Washington Post articles saying that the next leap in corona vaccine development could be a nasal spray, because if we deliver the vaccine in the nose, ideally we can wake up or train or educate the mucosal immunity as well. And so a few of my colleagues in Mount Sinai have actually created one of these mucosal vaccines, and it's one of these virus vectored vaccines. And here they actually place the spike protein on a different virus called NDV. It's called Newcastle disease virus. And NDV is uniquely a virus that only infects birds, and specifically chickens. And so they actually grow this vaccine in eggs, and then they're able to give this vaccine that expresses the spike protein either live or inactivated, and they give it both through intramuscularly with as an injection in the arm, or intranasally as a squirt in the nose. And so we helped to run one of these phase 1 studies here at Mount Sinai. Sorry, my computer's a little slow. Here we go. Now, so I wanted to say that there's two big advantages. One is that you can create this mucosal immunity that we're looking for. And the second thing is, because the virus, this NDV virus, it specifically can be grown in chicken eggs. The flu vaccine is actually grown in chicken eggs, and there are several countries that already have manufacturing capabilities to produce flu vaccines as well that can be repurposed for this vaccine to create a much cheaper and more globally distributed vaccine. And so we helped create, or we helped run this study. We called it an egg-based COVID-19 vaccine study. And then we enrolled 35 people into this study, into all these different cohorts. And it's a phase 1 study, so we're doing a safety study. And we did we gave one cohort, each cohort had 5 people. The first cohort got placebo or saline. The next 3 cohorts got either intranasal, intramuscular, or a combination of intranasal and intramuscular. And the last 3 cohorts had a higher dosage to see if that was safe. And so I'll share with you that our initial data shows that we were able to get a good response, essentially. So in the placebo cohort, we see over time, and this is in days, and 84 days is about 3 months. So if in the placebo cohort, we see that in the serum or in the blood, the anti-spike antibody titer wanes over time. And you see this nice decrease of fold induction. Whereas in the intranasal, we see up to 28-fold increase. And in the intramuscular, we saw about a 4-fold increase, and in the combination, we saw about a 5-fold increase. So we definitely saw good increases in antibodies in the blood. Another type of antibody we look for is called neutralization antibody titers, and we saw a very similar trend here where placebo waned or decreased over time over 3 months, but the other cohorts that received the vaccine showed pretty strong responses. And then most interesting is that we looked at the saliva and the antibodies in the saliva, and we also saw similar trends of antibodies waning in the placebo group, whereas the other groups had pretty strong responses or had measurable responses. So this is our research team. There's a lot of us, and then we've been working on this research, and we do several other studies and vaccine studies, and we are located on 102nd Street and Madison Avenue. And so this is our QR code. If you're ever interested in any sort of clinical research pertaining to infectious diseases, you're always welcome to give us a call. And so that's pretty much my talk. Thank you very much. And I always put this here to remind everyone to always wash your hands. Great.
Thank you so much for that. Yes,
No
wash your hands. Absolutely. I'm going to make sure we're spotlighted here. Okay. All right. Thank you so much for that. Yes, I have a 4-year-old daughter, so the hand washing talk is is pretty common in our house. So I have some questions for you, but I just from that presentation have some questions that popped up that maybe our audience is interested in as well. So can you tell us, you mentioned variants. How do variants work? Is it just ongoing? That are we just going to forever have different variants of COVID cropping up?
So that's a very good question. The there's no way to predict whether we'll always have variants popping up, but the likely answer is probably yes. Um, there have been before SARS-CoV-2, there have been several other coronaviruses that have existed amongst us for who knows how long, and they just kind of evolve as well. Viruses, when they replicate, they mutate very frequently, and uh, that's kind of the key to survival for all living things, right? You have to keep on evolving and mutating, and so viruses make so many of them. And each cell, when a virus infects one cell, there's millions of viruses that get created, and so there's so much variation amongst each cell of infected. So within a person, you can imagine how that's amplified into how many log orders of mutations. And then all it takes is different advantages and disadvantages or challenges to make certain mutants persist past and get better and stronger, and then they'll beat out their other siblings in the sense, and then keep on evolving and evolving. So it's always this kind of battle between the virus and the human immunity, or in our case, human immunity, that's saying like, how is this virus is trying to survive and trying to get into our bodies? And it's this spike protein just keeps on changing and changing. It's going to be it's a long battle. And so I'll say that influenza is similar, and it's been evolving, and there's been so many variants. Interestingly, one of the major flu subgroups have actually recently became extinct because of COVID, or not because of COVID, theoretically because of COVID, because everyone during that time when that flu strain, a flu B strain, was kind of less prevalent, and everyone suddenly went indoors and didn't talk to anybody else or interact with anybody else, there was no chance for that flu strain to keep moving on, and it actually disappeared, which is interesting. And that's Yamagata flu B strain. Yeah. So we can either live in isolated worlds and never have viruses, or we just learn how to deal with it in a sense, and accept that viruses will probably always be around. Yeah.
Yeah, and well, I think the thing that's interesting, it sounds like it's almost survival of the fittest as far as a virus kind of variant evolving goes. But then the curious thing is, I do feel like some of the COVID variants have actually been less, or maybe seemed less powerful. You know, you hear people saying like, "Oh yeah, the third time I got COVID, it was not really that big of a deal." So can you speak to that at all? Like, do you expect as variations grow that they might actually get worse for people who get infected, or do we just build a resilience to them?
Yeah, then that's where immunity comes in, right? Like, even if the virus gets stronger, our immune system keeps learning and learning and learning and is able to more quickly adjust and kind of stop this infection from hurting us. And so immunity is so important. And and like the data from our study shows that you have to keep in mind that immunity wanes and decreases with time. And so and that's a very important point that you saw in that data. Within 3 months, these placebo cohort, their immunity kind of waned about to half it, what it was. And in elderly populations, that waning seems to occur even more at an even greater rate. And so as you age, your immune system slows down and it can't remember things as well. And that's kind of why there's this recent push to get people above the age of 65 to get more to get that additional booster or as needed to try to really help remind their immune system, hey, don't forget about this. Keep this virus at the top of your list because we have to make sure you guys don't die. And if you look at the data, it's incredible. I forgot. I think it's within the last a 6 month period, there was like 28,000 people who died from COVID in the United States. 24,000 of them were people in that older age group.
Mm.
So these recommendations are really to protect that age group from these severe problems. And viruses really try to attack unfortunately, they really do most damage on the elderly, and immunocompromised people,
Right. Well, no, I'm glad you brought that up because I was planning on asking about the new CDC update, and it sounds like the medical community is behind that recommendation. Have you heard otherwise? Is there any kind of hesitation on that recommendation at all, or is it generally speaking basically what you said, that your immunity you can expect is going to kind of diminish a little bit faster, and so it's really critical to have that second dose?
For those people who are at risk of having severe disease, it's as medical professionals, we always defer to the people who write the guidelines, and they're actually very sound people, and they've been selected, and they have a lot of experience. So we defer to experts, and those experts say, hey, you should get this booster for if you're above the age of 65. So we agree, yeah, and the science makes sense, yeah.
And do you have any sense if it matters if it's a healthy 65 plus year old? Like, does that kind of rate of decline of immunity matter whether you're, maybe out there hiking every day and still running marathons versus somebody who may be more disposed, may be more inclined to have some sort of disease process happening?
I think that if you have more risk factors like obesity, diabetes, heart disease, you're taking some immunosuppressants because of some other sort of inflammatory illness, definitely those people who are at higher risk should definitely be more encouraged to get that boost. Yeah.
Okay. It's really interesting. Well, I think you probably answered this because I wanted to ask, why do some vaccines require boosters? So I think we have an understanding of why some require boosters. Why do some vaccines not require boosters?
It's all data driven. Yeah. It's all data driven. We see that, oh, okay, mm, this vaccine requires this many boosters and this vaccine requires only this many shots, and it's data driven based off of, and people do not want to give, trust me, people who like write these vaccines or give these vaccines really want to limit the number of vaccines you're getting too. Yeah.
So, okay, going back to the 65 plus, the new CDC rule, if somebody has found that they've had a reaction to the COVID-19 vaccine,
Mhm.
do you find that the medical community still recommends you go ahead and get that second dose? Does that outweigh the possible risk of
It
having a
really depends on
reaction?
what the reaction is. Yeah. I, you know, heard of incredible stories of different types of reactions where some people get a vaccine and then they end up in the ICU. I wouldn't give another vaccine to that person, right? The risks outweigh the benefit of it, and that's why medicine is really a person by person situation, and you have to look at each person is very unique, and what are their risks and what are their benefits for that person, and so it really needs to be weighed out. These recommendations are all kind of very broad, but then each person needs a doctor or physician or clinician NP to really make a judgment call. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Um, so speaking of allergic reactions, there were some allergic reactions that were caused by the COVID vaccine and booster, specifically Moderna. So just curious if you know if scientists have been able to alleviate that, if they've been able to kind of pull whatever was causing that out of the vaccine.
I haven't heard of it. The thing with these allergic reactions or like events, it's very hard to uh, because they happen so infrequently. It's very hard to kind of tease out what was it? Was it what component of the vaccine may have triggered an allergic reaction into a person? Because a lot of it also has to do with the person that had the reaction too. Um, and some people have severe allergic reactions to several things. I remember clearly I took care of a person once in residency that was in the ICU who had a severe allergic reaction to eating a munchkin. You know, it's hard, but then the number it's a very hard numbers game to figure out those things. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Um, Okay, so what do you suggest for people who have taken the initial COVID vaccine doses but have not, well, actually, I think you probably already explained this a bit. I mean, there are certainly people that are hesitant to follow this kind of instruction. So not sure if you have any tips around that you might tell, maybe you have to tell patients and kind of encourage them that this really is the right step for them to take.
For me, it really depends on the person too. You know, if if a person has several medical conditions and they're very elderly and they're at very high risk of um, getting really sick and dying from COVID, I'm going to push really hard to say, hey, you really need to understand the science and review the data. And that's why I like doing these kind of community things where I hopefully help explain and help people understand why these vaccines or how these vaccines work, so people feel more comfortable with what's going on. But but there are other people who just don't want to listen or don't want to share the ideas and have other ideas of misinformation that's out there, and that's and everyone ultimately is free to make their own decisions, and that's the beauty of our community, right? We don't we don't strictly enforce things as much as other communities do, and that's it's okay. It's America, right?
Well, we have an interesting question that came in sort of around this topic, which is, do you have any tips that, for our audience about discerning real facts about vaccines from rumors, from horror stories? There certainly have been a lot of those, especially with the COVID-19 vaccine. What are the most important health factors to discuss with your doctor when considering a vaccine? Maybe just can help people sift through what is real and what's not.
So uh, it's strange. Like the COVID pandemic came up right around the time that social media got crazy too, and then everyone's sharing their experiences, and I think that's great, and it's good to hear everyone's experience, but you have to take those experiences with a grain of salt too. You know, like you can get on a roller coaster and you can fly out of the seat, and that happens sometimes, and it does, right? but will it stop you from taking a roller coaster ride? I don't know. I don't think so. I think going back to the data, I, I I personally have a lot of trust and faith. I hate to say it that way, but in the people who write these guidelines, because they typically are very science-based people. And then I will go back into their data, and I will usually very frequently agree with them because they're very objective, and they take it's very data-driven decisions and data-driven guidelines. So any recommendations and guidelines, I usually try to find any website that has .gov in it. And you know, as a scientist, as a clinician scientist, I'm not super pro government by any means, but the scientists that they pick to make on these committees, like the NIH committee or the CDC committee, they're they're just clinicians and scientists who, like us, we all just want to help people. We don't really have a political motive or an ulterior motive. We're just there to like do what we're passionate about, which is to help make people safe and healthy. And so even though it has a .gov on it, it doesn't mean we're government employees. It usually means we've been selected by the government because we're experts in the field, and to help the community. And most of the time, I trust their judgment on things. Yeah. But
Well,
I always go back to science, and if you're worried, go look at the data, go look at the numbers, and then try to understand what the numbers mean. These one-off stories, they can throw you off terribly, and they're usually just one-offs. So look at the numbers is my hint or my recommendation to that. Trust me,
great.
I'm not a trusting person either. Trust me, I'm not. It's kind of backwards, but always go back to the data. You
No,
know,
I think that's uplifting. I think that, that knowing that someone in your field, that you feel confident in what's coming down the pike, and what, these people they're researching. This is their lives. This is what they're researching. So they're going to make sure the information they're providing is accurate. And yeah, so thank you for that. Well, I want to go back to your slides for a moment, because there were a few other questions that had cropped up from that. So you mentioned that there is the mRNA COVID vaccine, and then there is a protein version. Can you explain the difference in those a little bit more?
sure. So the mRNA vaccines, uh, goes back to that central dogma slide, right? The DNA can create RNA, and the RNA can create protein, right? Those three things. mRNA vaccines give the RNA part to the cell, and then the cell can read that as like a transcribed blueprint to make the protein itself. The protein vaccine just gives you the protein, and so it cuts it skips straight to the point. So they all lead to creating a spike protein within your cell, and so to teach your immune system, hey, that there's this viral spike thing that you should be aware of. And it's just different ways to tell the cell, to teach your immune system about spike protein.
Interesting. So it doesn't mean that the protein version like hits you harder because it goes directly to the point.
That not necessarily. It really, that hits you harder. It really depends on the science, and the
Mm.
science meaning like when they put that protein vaccine, uh, what are the numbers? You know, always go back to the numbers. But in theory, it's pretty much the same way to just show your immune system what a spike protein what the newest spike protein looks like. And
Okay.
that spike protein got the Novavax vaccine that makes the spike protein vaccine. It got updated for the 2023-2024 version. Same with the Moderna and Pfizer 2023-2024. They'll target this XBB variant.
Got it. So I hope I'm not asking the same question in a different way. You'll correct me if I am, but why are some vaccines comprised of live pathogens while others are comprised of killed pathogens?
That's totally based on how so if you think about it, like if you give a live pathogen to your immune system, they rarely give you a pathogen that's like deadly, because that's not that's dangerous. We never try to give dangerous vaccines. The live pathogen is usually what's called attenuated, or like a weakened version of the pathogen that you're looking for. Like, for example, flu, there's a live version of flu. Um, and that's so it's a weakened version, but the weakened version may replicate a little bit but won't cause you harm. So your immune system learns a lot more. It gets a much better feel now that it's kind of practiced with a weakened version of that pathogen. Whereas these kind of like protein or subunit things, yeah, you're depends on which pathogen it is. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. No, I think so. We understand that there's a lot of depth in all of these.
There's a lot of options. There are a lot of options.
Yeah. So we have a question that came in asking if you could elaborate on natural immunity versus vaccine acquired immunity.
That's a great question. That's a very great question, because if you think about natural immunity, say we're back to 2000 or late 2019, and no one's seen SARS-CoV-2, right? Everyone's naive in a sense. A person who uh, gets infected with SARS-CoV-2 and their body's never seen SARS-CoV-2, that SARS-CoV-2 is going to run its course, get you sick, and your immune system's going to learn a lot of information about SARS-CoV-2. So the next time you see SARS-CoV-2, your immune system should be much better prepared, right? A person who gets a vaccine gets a small piece of SARS-CoV-2, the spike protein, um, and then their immune system's not as not as advanced as the immune system that had to actually battle the infection. So, but the difference here is that, like, if you typically, an infection gives you better immunity than a vaccine, but an infection can kill you and harm you. And so that's why we give vaccines to prevent the harm that could occur versus the actual infection. I hope that explains that.
Got it. No, no, it does. I think this has been very informative. I just want to remind everyone to go ahead and please be typing any questions that you have into the chat. We have plenty here that we've crafted with the community that we'll continue asking along the way. So I wanted to ask, what can you tell people about long-term health problems that have been rumored to be linked with vaccines? Have you heard anything about? I do think there's sometimes, that word fear comes up, that I'm fearful of taking this because it might give me something else, or might be give me an elongated version of this disease.
So there are things like heart inflammation that have been associated with the mRNA COVID vaccines. It's called myocarditis, where the muscles of your heart kind of get inflamed, and that happens. That it's very rare, and if you look at the incidence of that kind of myocarditis um, versus the general community, that also happens naturally in the community. So it's hard to tell um, how much of it is due to the vaccine or how much of it is due to the natural baseline occurrence. But there has been associations with that inflammation, um, and it's things that you have to be aware of, that there are risks. And I think this is not emphasized enough, but every medical intervention that's offered to you has a risk. You know, you could take metformin, you could take Ozempic, you could take high blood pressure medication. Everything has a risk, and there's no free lunch. There's nothing that's not risk free here. So it's just a matter of understanding for the SARS-CoV-2 time, when you're gonna risk possibly getting really sick from COVID, or are you gonna worry about the risk of this heart inflammation? And it's all about balancing risks. Yeah.
And it sounds like it's not like you can necessarily go get a heart screening to see if you will possibly react with to a vaccine with heart inflammation.
Yeah, there is no hard screening yet. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, more work to be done. Okay, so we have a question coming in. If everyone had been vaccinated, would the COVID virus and variants have disappeared with no hosts available? That's a very interesting question.
Um, if everyone had been vaccinated with uh, that's, who knows? I think that that's a very difficult question, because one of the things that we have to remember is that these viruses aren't just infecting people, right? Viruses, and that brings you back to the whole um, connection or central dogma between us and animals and all living creatures and things. This virus is thought to come from an animal, right? Or a lab, who knows? But flu, if you look at flu, for example, influenza infects um, pigs very commonly, ducks, uh, whales, bats, you name it. And it's the same flu virus that goes throughout all these things. SARS-CoV-2 was found to infect cats, I think, and I think other pets. Just because you've vaccinated all the people does not mean that these viruses are not infecting other organisms, because they can jump. And we in the laboratories, people use ferrets and use hamsters to infect SARS-CoV-2 as well. And then so viruses jump between species, and just because everyone's vaccinated doesn't mean it's going to go away. Yeah,
It sounds like they would find a place to go. Is survival of the fittest. It would
yeah,
find,
it's kind of an amazing thing, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
interesting. So I was hoping that you might be able to take a minute or two to talk about some of the exciting research that you are working on currently, because part of this talk is we also wanted to look ahead to the future.
Thank you. I talked about the COVID vaccine that Mount Sinai is working on. That's one of our big projects. We also work on a mRNA based shingles vaccine study, which is happening right now. And there's several other kind of mRNA vaccine for influenza, which is coming down the line as well. A large part of our research team works on different uh, treatments and preventative treatments for HIV. And we also do mpox research as well. We do things called MAC, which many of you may not have heard of, a Mycobacterium avium research, cytomegalovirus research, all different types of infectious research. So if you ever have some questions or are interested, uh, our, our, our website was there, and we can always reach out to me and ask, you know.
Interesting. What do you think especially with your expertise in the world of vaccinations, what do you feel like our vaccine researchers took away from the pandemic? And, I imagine there must have been a lot of sharing of information and working together as a team, but like, if, something like COVID ever came up again, do you feel like the medical community really kind of learned something and took something away from the COVID pandemic to be maybe better equipped for the next time this possibly happens?
I think this mRNA technology was a huge jump. I'm pretty certain um, if the next pandemic comes around, the mRNA vaccine for virus B's here more quickly than we can even imagine. And and yeah, that I think yeah, I think that thing was huge, and the whole pandemic was. I can tell you because I was actually taking care of people in the hospitals. It was it was like a war. It really felt like being in a war zone and watching people die, and it was terrible. How do you describe? It's like, what was that movie? One of those war movies. it literally looked like, it felt like that, where every day you'd go and you'd strap in and you'd wear all these masks, and then you'd see people dying, and people all over the place were just grasping for air and like drowning in the room. It was terrible.
Well,
And
and yeah.
yeah, and I think a lot of us just became better prepared mentally and emotionally better prepared. And I think our hospitals are now much better prepared for something like this to occur. The science community is also very prepared now too. I think it was a big I think a big wake up call to say, hey, this can happen, and we have to be ready for this. Otherwise, millions of people will die. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, and that being said, do you feel like in the research and in there was such a mad dash to get this vaccine out to people for exactly the reasons you're saying. Nobody wanted to see the suffering happening. Were steps skipped along the way, do you feel, to kind of push this vaccine out in such a tremendously fast fashion?
I don't think any scientific steps were skipped. I think that I think a large part of the speed of at which the vaccine came out and why it came out so quickly and was needed to come out so quickly was funding. It's money. It's a money question, and money is like the fuel or the oil that greases the wheels, and the whole world was shut down essentially, and the government poured in a lot of money, and then Pfizer poured in its own money, and the money was there. And when the money is there, I don't know, a lot of people, none of the people listening may understand how difficult it is for science research. Well, as a researcher or as a scientist, probably like 50+% of the time that researchers spend their time on is trying to get money so that they can pay for the research that they're doing. And maybe much less than 50% of the time is actually doing the science. And it's really sad that way. You know, most scientists are not rich. We're not overflowing with money. We're looking for resources so that we can actually keep our laboratories and studies alive. And if you suddenly give us all this money, then you don't have, we're not spending time asking for money or writing grants and waiting for reviews. You write a grant, it takes about a month, 2 months. You send it off. You don't hear back for 2 months to get the money to pay for the thing, and then you can finally start setting things up. When money shows up, everything moves much more quickly than you can imagine. It's
Right.
sad.
To the
It's
chase.
really sad that way.
I mean, it's sad it had to, a pandemic had to happen to get that done quickly, but yeah,
That
that's
really, if the money was there, then so much more science would be happening much more quickly. But the money's
yeah.
not there, you know? Yeah.
Well, Dr. Liu, I want to thank you so much. Are there any closing remarks that you wanted to make on vaccines in general for our audience? Any takeaways that you feel
Uh,
passionate about sharing?
I think that is, I guess the takeaway is really, if you don't know how something works, just ask and try to learn about how things work. Don't be scared of the unknown, because usually there's a whole history and a whole community of scientists who probably looked into it and tried to understand why things work, and that's all available wonderfully on the internet and Google Scholar or anything. You can learn about things and look at the data always. I like I said, I don't trust many people. I usually just go back to the data and look at the data, try to understand what does their data say, and then always try to see the raw data if you can, and you know, and that'll make you feel better about believing in why people are telling you to do something, and always keep an open mind about things before you jump into it. I see this Jennifer person has a hand raised.
Yeah, she's with our team. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Jennifer, you can let us know if you have a question in the chat. I think maybe it's just up there by accident. But oh, let's see. Okay. No.
Okay.
So, but thank you for your beautiful description of everything. I feel like you made the science very understandable and graspable. So I appreciate your time so much this evening. We hope to have you back at Spark Your Health soon. And again, I want to thank everyone for joining us for this really special Spark Your Health talk this evening. We do have a free Q&A coming up with Dr. Greger this coming Thursday, which is he's the author of How Not to Age and How Not to Die, and lots of different sort of nutritional facts and questions we'll be asking on Thursday. And with that, I hope that everyone has a wonderful evening. Dr. Liu, thank you for all of the work that you're doing in advancing vaccines. We really appreciate it, and we can see that it's making the world a safer place. So thank you all and have a good evening.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.